James chose silence over excuses. Instead of grand promises or explanations, he made up for everything with one simple, heartfelt gesture, placing an iPhone 17 Pro Max into Diep's trembling hands. It wasn't about the phone itself, but the meaning behind it. A quiet apology, a promise of care, and a reminder that even in the smallest actions, his love for her had never faded. In that gentle moment, Diep understood. Sometimes love doesn't need words to be felt.
The house was quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting. It was the kind of silence that lingered after words had already done their damage, after apologies were swallowed and explanations came too late. Outside, the afternoon light slid slowly across the floor, marking time that neither James nor Diep seemed ready to acknowledge.
They had not argued loudly. There were no slammed doors, no dramatic exits. Instead, the tension crept in through small moments, unanswered messages, tired eyes, conversations that ended too quickly. Life, with all its weight, had pressed down on James from every direction. Work, family expectations, responsibilities he never asked for but could not escape. And Diep, standing quietly beside him, had carried her own share of disappointment without complaint. James noticed the change before he understood it. Diep still cooked, still smiled, still asked if he had eaten. Yet something in her warmth had dimmed, like a lamp turned lower rather than switched off. She no longer waited for him to come home. She no longer asked how his day had been. These were not punishments, they were shields. At night, James lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of ordinary life. The hum of the fan, the distant barking of dogs, the occasional motorbike passing by. These sounds reminded him of how simple life used to feel, back when love seemed effortless. Now love felt like something fragile, something that required care and attention he had failed to give. He wanted to say sorry. The word hovered in his chest, heavy and insufficient. How do you apologize for absence? For emotional distance, for being physically present but mentally somewhere else? James understood that words alone would feel empty now. Diep, on the other hand, found comfort in routine. She watered the plants each morning, organized her work, and spent her evenings quietly scrolling through an old phone whose cracked screen mirrored her exhaustion. She never complained, and that, James realized, hurt more than anger ever could. Sometimes love does not break in a single moment. It erodes slowly, through neglect, through exhaustion, through the belief that the other person will always understand. James stood at the edge of that realization, afraid yet determined. He knew he could not undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could begin again. Not with grand promises, not with dramatic confessions, but with a small, thoughtful gesture, one that said, without words, I see you, I remember you, and I'm trying. James had never been good at grand declarations. He was not the kind of man who knew how to turn regret into poetry or love into speeches that made people cry. His apologies, when spoken, always sounded awkward, too stiff, too late. So this time he chose silence again, but a different kind of silence, one that carried intention. The idea came to him on an ordinary afternoon, while he was standing in line at a small electronics store near the main road. The place was crowded with people comparing prices, children tugging at their parents' sleeves, and salespeople repeating the same phrases over and over. It felt painfully normal, and somehow that made his decision feel right. James remembered how Diep had once laughed about her old phone freezing whenever she tried to take photos of Nie, how she used it for everything, work, study, keeping in touch with the world, yet never complained when it failed her. She always found a way around inconvenience, as if her own needs could wait forever. When the salesperson placed the iPhone 17 Pro Max on the counter, its sleek surface catching the light, James hesitated. It was expensive, yes, but more than that, it represented something he feared being misunderstood. He did not want it to feel like compensation or control. He wanted it to feel like care.
He paid quietly and asked for no special packaging, no card, no explanation rehearsed in advance. Just the phone, wrapped simply, like an everyday object meant to be used, not admired.
That evening, James came home earlier than usual. Diep was in the kitchen, moving gently between the stove and the sink, her movements practiced and calm. He stood there for a moment, watching her, realizing how many times he had walked past moments like this without truly seeing them. "I bought something for you," he said softly, his voice unsure. Diep turned, surprised, not by the words, but by the way he said them. He placed the small box on the table between them, as if afraid to push it closer.
"It's not anything big," he added, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. What James didn't say was that this wasn't about the phone. It was about acknowledging her quiet endurance, about easing a small part of her daily burden, about saying, "I'm here now," without demanding forgiveness in return. The box sat there, unopened, holding more than technology. It held an apology James was still learning how to give.
Diep did not open the box right away. That pause, small, almost unnoticeable, made James hold his breath. In everyday life, moments like these happen quietly, without an audience, yet they carry the weight of decisions that shape relationships. Diep simply stood there, her fingers resting on the edge of the table, as if she were trying to read the meaning of the gesture before touching it.
She had received gifts before. Some were generous, some well-intended, others careless, but this felt different. James was not smiling expectantly. He was not watching her reaction. Instead, he busied himself with something trivial, straightening a chair, wiping a surface already clean. It told her more than words ever could. Finally, she opened the box.
The iPhone 17 Pro Max lay inside, pristine and impossibly new, reflecting the soft kitchen light. For a moment, Diep felt overwhelmed, not by its value, but by the sudden realization that James had noticed the small details of her life. He knew how often her old phone failed her, how she depended on it for work, learning, and staying connected. He had listened, even when she thought he wasn't.
Her first instinct was to refuse. "This is too much," she whispered, not out of politeness, but out of fear. Fear that accepting it might mean accepting everything else without being heard. James shook his head gently. "It's not to make up for everything," he said. "It's just something I can do right now." Those words softened something inside her. Diep turned the phone on. The screen lit up, bright and clear, and for a brief second she smiled, a real smile, unguarded and warm. James noticed it immediately, and the tension he had been carrying loosened, just a little. She didn't thank him right away. Instead, she sat down and began transferring her data, her movements slow and thoughtful. The ordinary act became symbolic, moving memories, contacts, and unfinished messages into a space that felt new, a quiet reset. In that moment, Diep understood that love was not in the price of the gift, but in the humility behind it. James wasn't trying to erase the past. He was standing beside her in the present, offering support without demand. And James, watching her, realized something too. Sometimes healing begins not with forgiveness spoken aloud, but with understanding allowed to grow, silently, patiently, in the middle of an ordinary evening. Night fell gently, without announcement. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows that stretched across the quiet road. Inside the house, nothing dramatic happened. No promises were made, no tears fell. Yet something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the moment when a storm passes and the air finally becomes easier to breathe. Diep sat on the sofa, the new phone resting in her hands. She wasn't exploring its features or admiring its design. Instead, she scrolled through her contacts, pausing at familiar names, rereading old messages. Everyday life, stored neatly inside a small device. James watched from a short distance, careful not to intrude.
For the first time in days, he didn't feel the urge to explain himself.
"Can I take a photo?" Diep suddenly asked. James looked up, surprised. "Now?" She nodded, lifting the phone. He hesitated, then laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar even to himself. The camera clicked. The image captured was imperfect. Uneven lighting, tired eyes, a half-smile that hadn't fully learned how to return yet. But it was honest. Diep showed him the screen. "It's not very good," she said. James shook his head. "It's real." They shared a quiet laugh, and with it, the tension eased further. It reminded them of how many moments in life are like this, unplanned, unpolished, but meaningful simply because they happen.
Later, they sat together with cups of warm tea, the kind that cooled too quickly if you forgot about it. They talked about small things, what to cook tomorrow, errands that needed to be done, a neighbor's dog that barked too much. These conversations might have seemed trivial to anyone else, but to them, they felt like bridges, reconnecting spaces that had gone silent for too long. James realized then that making up for something didn't always mean grand sacrifices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it meant paying attention again, showing up, offering something useful, thoughtful, and sincere. As the night grew deeper, Diep placed the phone carefully on the table, as if acknowledging its place in her life, without letting it define the moment. She looked at James, her voice calm.
"Thank you for thinking of me." That was all she said, and it was enough. In the quiet of that ordinary night, James understood something simple and profound. Love doesn't always return with fireworks. Sometimes it comes back quietly, like light through a window, or trust rebuilt through small, everyday care. The story of James and Diep teaches us that love is not measured by dramatic gestures or expensive gifts, but by attention, humility, and timing. In daily life, people often believe that repairing a relationship requires grand apologies or emotional speeches. Yet this story quietly challenges that belief, reminding us that healing often begins with something much smaller and much more sincere.
One of the most important lessons is that understanding comes before forgiveness. James does not rush Diep to forgive him, nor does he demand that his gesture erase past hurt. Instead, he acknowledges her struggles by noticing the details of her everyday life, the cracked phone, the silent endurance, the way she keeps going without complaint. This teaches us that real care is shown through observation. When we truly see another person, we begin to understand their pain without being told.
Another lesson lies in the meaning of giving. The iPhone James gives Diep is not a symbol of wealth or control, but of respect. He does not use it to buy her silence or affection. He offers it quietly, without conditions. In real life, gifts often become tools of expectation, but this story shows that a gift becomes meaningful only when it is free of pressure. True generosity does not ask for anything in return. The story also reminds us that emotional wounds are often caused by absence rather than cruelty. James never intended to hurt Diep. He was simply overwhelmed and distracted. This reflects a common reality in modern life, where stress and responsibility slowly pull people away from one another. The lesson here is that neglect, even unintentional, can damage love just as deeply as harsh words. Presence, both physical and emotional, is essential. Finally, the story teaches us that rebuilding trust is a gradual process. One gesture cannot fix everything, but it can open a door. Diep's acceptance of the gift is not instant forgiveness. It is an invitation to try again. Love, in this sense, is not a destination, but a continuous act of choosing one another through small, consistent care. In the end, the lesson is clear. Love survives not because of perfection, but because of willingness. The willingness to notice, to show up, and to begin again, quietly.